Columbia presents Corwin. Tonight, Norman Corwin brings you Charles Laughton and Elsa Lanchester in The Moat Farm Murder, with an original score composed and conducted by Bernard Herrmann.
This program is an authentic word-for-word confession of a murder committed by an Englishman named Dougal 41 years ago. Except for occasional dialogue indicated in the confession itself, what you'll hear in Mr. Laughton's direct narration is exactly what the murderer told the British police, and is reproduced in his very own words. Charles Laughton and Elsa Lanchester in The Moat Farm Murder.
And now, if the stenographer's ready, we'll proceed with Mr. Dougal's confession from where we left off in our last session. Go ahead, Mr. Dougal.
I did not find Miss Holland as generous as I expected. And as I didn't have very much money, I suggested that we should buy a farm. I should think we looked at about a dozen farms altogether, but none of them suited me until I came across the Moat House farm. It was just the place I wanted. When she complained of its loneliness, I said that that was its charm, because we should be able to live there together away from any inquisitive strangers.
I see.
Everything went all right up to the time that the farm was purchased. And I certainly did intend that the deed should be made out in my name, but to this Miss Holland would not consent. And therefore all the visions I had had of getting hold of the farm, turning her out and selling it, melted away.
Mm-hmm.
Finding she was so tight-fisted, I began to think of various schemes to put her out of the way. But I thought I'd wait a little while and see if she altered. I think she was naturally very close. It was a strange thing to find a woman so close, because otherwise she was not so bad. And she'd often try when I was miserable or down in the dumps to cheer me up by playing or singing to me. She was old-fashioned in a lot of her ways. When I suggested that she should buy herself new dresses and wear more fashionable clothes, she said she'd wear what she liked.
I will wear what I like. Is that clear? I don't want to be in the fashion. And in my view, if two people were fond of each other, it doesn't matter what they wear, does it?
She had a lot of clothing belonging to her aunt. And she was always twisting, mending, and altering a lot of old dresses that I wouldn't have given house room to. She was rather snappy at times. If I didn't quite agree with everything she said, she'd bounce out of the room.
Very well. If that's how you feel.
Perhaps toward the evening, she'd get over her temper, and then she'd come downstairs and plead for forgiveness.
Oh, Herbert.
What is it?
I'm sorry about losing my temper.
How are you now?
Yes. I'm afraid I was sharper than I need have been. Do you forgive me?
Oh, yes, Cecily, so long as you realize that I was right in the matter.
I suppose you were right, Herbert.
Then let's forget it.
It's only my state of nerves, really, that make me give way to such temper.
I didn't mind these fits of temper because they gave me an opportunity of clearing out and having a good day and a game or two of billiards. I was drinking very heavily then because I'd made up my mind by this time either to get a lump sum out of her and clear out, or put her out of the way and have the lot. I made up my mind at last to put her out of the way. I used to sit and think about it for hours because, although I'd done a lot of things during my life, I couldn't quite make up my mind to go so far as to murder her. I tried to get her to make a will, leaving everything to me, while I made one also, leaving everything to her.
But why do that?
It only seems to me the right and proper thing to do.
Well, I've already made my will.
You have?
Yes, and I don't intend to alter it.
All this caused me a lot of trouble. I used to sit for hours, conjuring up all kinds of schemes to get rid of her. But this time I got positively to hate her. When we actually moved it to the farm, I'd definitely decided what I should do. I thought that a very good place to bury her would be the ditch. That was why the very first week we were at the farm, I gave orders for it to be filled in. Although she knew nothing about my purpose, she came out of the house and stood by the side of the ditch whilst I and Pilgrim, the labourer, were discussing the best way to fill it up. The elder tree stood by the side, and I can see her there now, holding one of the boughs and arguing against the ditch being filled in until proper arrangements had been made for draining it another way.
I don't think you know what you're about, Herbert.
Cicely, my dear, I know very well what I'm doing.
But I have a right to my opinion, and more than a right to discuss what is being done on this farm. Why, this labourer here knows more than you do about it.
I prefer that we leave him out of it.
Pilgrim! Pilgrim!
Yes, ma'am?
How do you think this should be done?
Well, ma'am, I think the proper way to do the job is to make the new drain first and then fill in the ditch.
There. You see, Herbert?
I see nothing of the sort. I'd made up my mind what I was going to do with her, so it didn't suit my purpose to accept his advice. And I insisted on the work being commenced at once, although I didn't want the filling in completed. I don't think I should have done it had I not been drinking heavily. But the more drink I had, the more determined I became, and the easier it looked. I wanted money very badly then, and I made one final appeal to Miss Holland to let me have some money, but she refused.
I know very well what you want that money for, to spend it on drink. Well, you can't have it.
She was so close that she wouldn't trust me with even the wages to pay the farm hands. And at last, I was pushed in such a corner that I determined to finish the matter that week. Of course, I knew all about firearms. When the wind was in a certain direction, I fired the revolver off several times in the coach house in order to see if anyone heard it while they were in the back of the house. I was very glad to find that nobody heard any report, and I placed the revolver, fully loaded, and some cartridges, on a shelf in the coach house, ready for me when I wanted it. It was there 7 or 8 days before I finally used it.
Just a moment, Mr. Dougal. What about the testimony of the servant girl that you made advances to her late one night?
What that servant girl says about going to her door is about right, although I think she exaggerates a little. I'd had a skinful of brandy that night. Well, Miss Holland and I had quite a row. She accused me of a lot of things. Of course, I declared that the servant's story was a lie from top to bottom, but she stuck up for the girl, and she made herself so ill that she cried very nearly the whole of one day. On Friday morning, we'd made it up. I'd got her round her by lunchtime, and we made up our quarrel, and she'd forgiven me, and that was why we thought of going for a drive. As it was a beautiful night, we let the horse walk slowly home. I should think it was about 8:15 when we got back to the farm. When I'd taken the horse out, I thought she'd go in the house. But instead of that, she made some remark about its being a beautiful moonlight night. I'd pushed the trap into the coach house by this time. I stepped up on the side of the trap, reached down the revolver, and as Miss Holland stood just near the door looking at the moon, I shot her. She dropped just like a log. And then I pulled her into the coach house. If I live to be 1,000 years old, I shall never forget the feeling as I caught hold of both her hands and drew her along until I got her into the coach house. All kinds of things came into my mind. My heart seemed almost to stand still as I put my hand inside her dress to feel if her heart was beating. Of course, I knew that she was dead. And yet I don't know what made me do it, but I knelt down on one knee and pulled her head and asked her to speak to me if she could. Cicely, Cicely, speak to me. Cicely, don't you see me? Cicely. I didn't think this was of much use, And why I did it I can't tell even now, but I thought for a moment that she might come to because there was no blood about and I wasn't quite certain where the bullet had struck her. Great beads of perspiration began to run down my back. And when I left the coach house, I had a most peculiar sensation, as if someone was following me. I thought the doors of the coach house had opened, and she was walking out after me. I could almost feel her touch me. And as true as a God in heaven, sir, I was ready to drop. I must have stood there some seconds, and then I put my hand into my pocket and drew out the revolver, and turned around and looked straight at the coach house. I couldn't quite get out of my mind nor get rid of the feeling that something or someone besides myself stood between me and the coach house. So I levelled up the revolver and stood there with it in my hand. I don't think I could have uttered a word to have saved my life. My tongue was like a great ball of fire, and I quite hurt myself trying to get some saliva to moisten my mouth and my parched tongue. Oh, then I remembered how silly it was, and of course there was no one, and I put the revolver back into my pocket and walked into the house. We usually kept some brandy in a decanter in the sitting room. So I pushed the door open, and I picked up the decanter without waiting for a glass. I think I must have gulped down half of its contents. Every few minutes I broke into a violent perspiration. Then my tongue would become so hot and my lips so dry that I had to rub them with my fingers to get some feeling into them. I seized the brandy bottle again. I had another good swig at it. And I don't know why, but I thought it might be all a mistake, that perhaps after all the bullet hadn't struck her, that she'd only fainted and she might come to if I gave her some brandy. So I caught hold of the decanter and walked across with it in my hand to the coach house. I couldn't make up my mind for a second or two to go inside. I called out, "Cecily! Cecily!" Then I thought what a fool I was, because everything had gone just as I'd planned it and there was not a living soul near. I had nothing to fear. Then I went into the coach house, and it was dark, and I pushed the door further open so that some of the light from the moon would come in. She was in exactly the same position as I'd left her. So I knelt down and poured some of the brandy over her face, thinking perhaps it might revive her. But really I knew this was impossible, because she was dead. I tried to sit her up, but she fell back, and I knew all was over then. Of course, I had arranged everything, and I'd mapped out days before where I was going to bury her, but I sat down and began thinking over new schemes, and every few minutes I kept touching her and feeling her pulse and speaking to her. I tried to smoke a cigar, but I had to light it a dozen times because I forgot all about it. It went out. I made up my mind that it'd be best not to put her in the ditch, but to take her away and bury her somewhere else. So I took off her hat and her veil and the jacket she was wearing, and I picked her up in my arms and walked down by the side of the little moat. Her head was leaning over my shoulder. As I carried her along, I wished there was a great big furnace there that I could put her in and watch her burn. I thought of cutting her up into pieces and putting her into the moat, but I thought of the time it'd take me, and I was afraid of being interrupted. Somehow I wanted to bury her out of sight, and yet I wanted to keep her by the side of me. So I went back to the field and picked her up again and carried her over to one of the haystacks. I found then that she was getting cold and stiff, for there was a strong breeze blowing, and it was rather a cold night. It was a horrible sight to see her lying on the ground, and before I picked her up the last time, I wished that she was alive again, because I thought, after all, she hadn't done me any harm. So I knelt down and kissed her once or twice. All the good times we had seemed to come back to me. And I remembered once or twice when I had been queer through the drink. She'd nursed me and tried to get me well. But after all, it was a bit hard to do her in. Then I began to think what had happened to me if she was found. I thought I'd hide her in the haystack for a few days. Finally, I made up my mind that I'd get rid of her once and for all. I went and got the fork. And I carried some straw and laid it down at the bottom of the ditch. I think the brandy then began to have some effect upon me, and I grew more brutal. And I began to think of the way she'd nagged me and the difficulty I had in getting money from her. Caught hold of her hand and pulled the ring off her finger. She was very fond of this ring. It had been given to her by the only man I really believe she ever loved. I asked her to tell me the story one day, and she did. She said that while her aunt kept a ladies' school at Liverpool, she used to help her in the management.
And whilst doing so,
she grew
I grew very fond of the brother, one of the pupils, a midshipman who had returned home from a voyage. The young man and I fell in love with each other, almost at first sight, and he vowed that he would make his fortune abroad and return and marry me. He had some relatives in the West Indies, and he went out there shortly afterwards and took up some kind of post. He used to write letters to me. But just when everything looked bright, and he was drowned through the upsetting of a yacht, and his body was not recovered for some days. When it was found, the ring that he wore on his finger was taken off and sent home to his parents. Who gave it to me?
Well, I took that ring off her finger. And just as I did so, a stray moonbeam came through a cloud and played about her face. It made me quite shudder. Also, I put my hand down and caught hold of the gold cross that was round her neck and wrenched it off, snapping the chain on which it used to hang round her neck. I had another drop of brandy then, and I turned her over, put my hand in her pocket and took her purse. I don't think I knew what I was doing then. I picked her up in my arms just as you'd carry a baby, sir, and laid her on the straw. Then a change came over me. The more brandy I drank, the more brutal and wicked I seemed to get. One minute I wanted to kiss her, and the next minute I wanted to pitch a lot of mould over her. But at last I made up my mind that I'd bury her and get her out of sight. I thought of what had happened but a few days before when she stood by the side of the ditch talking to Pilgrim and myself about filling in the ditch.
I don't think you know what you're about, Herbert.
I thought perhaps unless I covered her over, the fowls would scratch away the straw, so I got some brambles and twigs and pieces of wood, and I stretched them over her body. And I went back to the house and had some more brandy, and then I went to bed. I couldn't sleep. And I got up and walked around the farm and down to the road and back again. I couldn't keep my eyes off the ditch. I'm sure I aged that night 20 years. I never closed my eyes the whole night long. And I couldn't keep still or rest for even a quarter of an hour. I tried to read. I tried to write. I tried to sleep. But it was all in vain. Not one single moment's peace did I have. I'm sure that if I went once to the ditch, I went 20 times. I now began to wish that all traces of this night were obliterated. I was tempted once or twice to pitch the ring and the cross into the moat, but somehow I couldn't do it. Well, one of the first things I did was to open Miss Holland's desk and go through a lot of her papers in order to find out, if possible, how much money she had. She kept her accounts very neatly, But I was very disappointed when I found that she was not worth more than £6,000 or £7,000. I thought perhaps Miss Holland had some more cash concealed about the place somewhere. So I turned over her trunks and boxes, but I couldn't find any. And I certainly did feel somewhat disappointed. I used to have terrible dreams at night. As I went about the house, I used to fancy I could hear Miss Holland's voice. I think if I went once to look at that ditch, I went 100 times a day. And I'm sure if anyone had watched me, they'd have grown suspicious and thought there must be something under that ditch.
Yes? Go on, Mr. Dougal.
I come now to a terrible part of my life because, however clever one may be, and however well one's plans are being carried out, there always is the suspicion lurking at the back of your head that you may have made one little blunder which will lead to the truth coming out. It's all very well to try and drown your thoughts in drink. And as sure as I'm alive on this earth, no one tried harder than I did to banish entirely from my mind all recollections of that terrible night. But I found that it was physically impossible.
What a beautiful moonlight night.
Didn't matter where I was or who was with me. The moment there was a lull in the conversation, the moment my attention was taken from anything, away back to the farm went my thoughts. As sure as I stand here, sir, I can swear I've gone into the coach house hundreds of times, expecting to see her lying on her back as I dragged her in there. But nothing would make me believe that she wasn't until I'd gone in and seen for myself.
Herbert.
I did this 2 or 3 times a day sometimes. And all the time, I knew that I'd buried her in the ditch and she was still there. I've tried to reason with myself times out of number, but it was no good. I had to go into that coach house and see for myself that she was not there. Sometimes, when I've been walking along or sitting in the railway carriage, I've closed my eyes and tried to make myself believe that it was all a dream, and that Miss Holland wasn't dead, and that it was some foolish thought that I'd got into my mind. I've got up and said to myself, oh, you're not a murderer, old man, whatever else you may be. And I've sat down again and I felt much better and more satisfied. But unfortunately, this didn't last very long.
Herbert.
A few minutes later, my mind travelled back to May the 19th. And there I could see myself loading the revolver in the morning, putting it on the shelf, and then taking the pony out of the trap.
What a beautiful moonlight night.
And standing on the step and shooting her. Why, 3 years after she'd been dead, I could close my eyes and still feel that I had her in my arms. I could still feel her head hanging over my shoulders. And I could still see her face as I laid her in the ditch. At one time, drink would send me to sleep. And perhaps for a few hours I'd forget all about the Moat farm. But as time went on, I found it impossible to get a night's rest. Then I took to walking in my sleep. And I thought I should have gone mad when I found out I was a somnambulist. I remember one night I returned from London and I don't think I was quite sober. And after having a good look round, I went to bed, I should think about 11 o'clock. I remember quite well taking off my clothes and getting into bed. But just before daybreak, I suddenly came to myself and I found that I was standing by the side of the ditch, and that a spade was in my hand. I was in my nightshirt, and I'd got out of the bedroom, walked down the stairs, opened the door, crossed over the Moat Bridge, gone into the coach house, and then gone to the grave with the spade in my hand. I think I must have been standing there a long time because I was very cold and my nightshirt was wet with dew. I shook from head to foot and my teeth chattered. I was aching in every limb when I awoke, so I pitched the spade back into the coach house and went back to bed. And there I lay awake, counting the hours. I was really afraid of myself, and I thought that one of these mornings the labourers would come in and find me standing there, and I thought of all kinds of methods to prevent myself being found there. The only way I could prevent myself walking out to the ditch in my sleep was locking the gate at the entrance of the Moat Bridge. I put a bit of chain around it. Before I went to bed, I used to see that it was padlocked. Although this did not prevent me walking in my sleep, it stopped me going out to the ditch, because I used to go right up to the gate, and as it was locked, I feel certain I used to turn round and go back to bed. I know I did this, because one day the gate was painted white. When I woke up one morning, I found my hands covered in white paint, which showed that I'd been down to the gate and tried to open it. I got very ill about this time.
Tell me, Mr. Dougal, when did you first begin to sense danger? Before or after the investigation was started?
When the superintendent called at the farm, I began to see danger, and I thought it best to leave the farm once and forever. I didn't know where I was going when I left it, and sometimes I didn't seem to care whether they found me out or whether they didn't. I was so tired of it all. And yet the moment I thought of a hand being placed on my shoulder, I conjectured up all kinds of pictures. I have seen myself tried. I have heard myself sentenced. And I felt myself standing on the scaffold with the rope round my neck. But at times, as I sat in my cell, I often thought that after all, I was only living a life of misery, and it would be better to end it.
You have been listening to Charles Laughton and Elsa Lanchester in The Moat Farm Murder, adapted by Norman Corwin from a true confession and directed and produced by him as the 18th in his current series of broadcasts. Bernard Herrmann composed and conducted the musical score. Heard on the program tonight with Mr. Laughton and Miss Lanchester was Raymond Lawrence. From New York, next week at this same time, Columbia presents Corwin's production of The Fourth Decade by the young American poet Norman Roston. Dick Cutting speaking. This is CBS, the Columbia Broadcasting System.